territories than it is in Alaska, where they tend to have these nice fluffy feather mosses. So those burn much more easily. You can have a much deeper burn with less carbon being released. But it also has implications if you have these deep burns. That's when you end up with these exposed soils where we saw poplar coming in. So shallower burns, lots of carbon released, but the fact that we have sort of different moss communities may suggest that these systems are more resilient from an ecological perspective. So just as a little recap on that piece, again, it's these kind of moist, not too wet, not too dry parts of the landscape where we see the greatest carbon emissions. And we're seeing different patterns in the Northwest Territories as a consequence of these different ground vegetation communities. So our second question there was, what are the main drivers of ground veg recovery? When we think about ground vegetation recovery, we often think about the depth of burn. As I mentioned to you before, so here's a nice picture of a resprouter. That's sort of small, but you can see, I think that's my hand in the background, in fact, and that all of this structure here, you see a little tiny leaf up there, that's a new Labrador tea plant growing up from this big below ground rooting system. So this is a really common way that plants in the Boreal understory recover after fire. That sort of assumes a fairly shallow depth of burn. If you burn too deep, you start to damage those below ground structures, and you don't end up with the same sort of vegetative recovery. As you start to move along through getting into deeper burns, sort of intermediate level burns, you end up with a lot of seed bank species. So there's seeds that are stored in the soil. If you burn deep enough, a lot of those end up coming into the system. And then if you have a really severe burn, we end up with these dispersers, so colonizers from outside of the stand coming in and recruiting, and poplar is a great example of that. So we have these ideas about how we think regeneration should respond to fire. And what we see, so here's a much better picture of that, that's much bigger. You can see that beautiful rhizome. What we have here is a proportion of the percent of the total number of individuals recorded. So we went around and at every plot we set up, we dug up 2 individuals of every species we found to see how they were recovering. Were they resprouting? Were they recovering from seed? What was the mechanism that was allowing them to regenerate? And we see that, so here's recovery from seed, here's recovery from rhizome, so this is regeneration mode. And in both the Taiga plains, which is the A panel, and the Taiga shield, which is the B panel, we see about 80% of all individuals recovering via rhizome, so recovering via resprouting, which again suggests that the depth of burn in these fires in the Northwest Territories in 2014 simply wasn't sufficient to really damage these rhizomes and drive a shift in terms of the types of plants that were coming in. So when we're seeing resprouting, we see basically recovery of the same kinds of species that were there before fire. We definitely saw some cedars coming in, some species coming in from seed, I should say. Don't confuse that with cedar, but to a much lesser extent than resprouting. We see the same. We do see the patterns that are expected. So this on the x-axis is the proportion of the soil organic layer combusted. So what percent of that pre-fire organic layer was burned away? And here we have the proportion of individuals regenerating from rhizomes. So when you have an intact organic layer, you have nearly 100% of your community recovering from rhizome. And that drops down. You see this negative relationship where when you get to 100% combustion of the soil organic layer, you're down to only about 40% of individuals recovering via resprouting. Same pattern on the Taiga shield. So we see the kinds of patterns we're expecting, but most, a very large proportion of all individuals measured were recovering via resprouting. This compares yeah. Oh, sorry about that. Each dot is a plot. So those transects that I showed you. So it's this is the proportion of individuals at that site that were recovering via resprouting. The rest of it, so if you have, say, this dot, or let's take this one, it's about 80%. That means 80% of the individuals were at that site were recovering from structures below ground. 20% were coming in by seed. Okay? If we take a look at some Alaskan data, similar kinds of patterns. So these bars, so we have resprouters here, colonizers here. We'll just ignore this for the moment. And this is relative frequency. So again, the percent of individuals coming in by resprouting or by colonization. And we see, again, low severity, moderate severity fires, we have more resprouters. Very severe fires, we have more colonizers. So the same kinds of patterns. But again, we really saw a pretty high proportion of individuals coming back from below ground. So main drivers of ground vegetation recovery corresponded very closely with that proportional loss of the soil organic layer, which, as you recall, really corresponded with the landscape positions. So drier parts of the landscape, dry and moist, the sort of moist parts of the landscape tended to have a higher proportional loss of the soil organic layer than the wet parts of the landscape. So we tended to have more resprouters coming in wet parts of the landscape. The drier parts were places where we saw a little bit more of a change. Now the third question, is there evidence of forest successional shifts associated with severe burning, like we've seen in Alaska? And just to remind you of that figure, so here's our pattern of self-replacement where black spruce is burned. You end up with black spruce recruitment and black spruce recovery. Following severe fire or a short fire return interval, this can shift. You can lose that organic layer and other species, in the case of Alaska poplar, come in. We aren't seeing really strong evidence for this in the Northwest Territories. Here we have the Taiga plains, and I'll walk you through this figure. So this is year 1, this is year 2. We revisited these sites repeatedly. Again, this is a proportional change. So if it's 0, you see no change from the pre-fire condition. We measured what was in the pre-fire stand, and we counted the seedlings in the post-fire community. So if it's 0, you have exactly the same representation of say black spruce in the stand after fire as before fire. If it's a positive value, you have an increase in the dominance of that species. If it's a negative value, you have a decrease in the dominance of that species. So in the Taiga plains, the main deciduous player was poplar. And what we see is in year 1, we see an increase in poplar and a slight decrease in black spruce. And this trend was a real trend, but it disappeared after the second year. So we had a lot of recruitment of poplar in the first year, but then those individuals died off, and we ended up with something that was very, very similar to pre-fire conditions in the second, by year 2. On the Taiga shield, the main deciduous species coming in is birch. And in both year 1 and year 3, so we measured this one in year 3, not year 2, just because of logistical reasons, we see maintenance of an increase in birch and a decrease in black spruce, or conifers, sorry. So there's some evidence here that birch is doing better post-fire than it was pre-fire. But it's sort of moving toward the middle here. And I'll note that a lot of these sites were pretty northerly sites, Wekwati, Gamati, and recruitment there is very slow. We're finding that it's taking a long time to kind of saturate recruitment. So these patterns may change. So I'm sort of skeptical that we're seeing any evidence of an increase in deciduous dominance in this system. But there's a twist in the story in the Northwest Territories. So here's the distribution through North America of black spruce, the distribution of trembling aspen. I could have thrown up a similar distribution of birch. We also have jack pine. This is not present in Alaska. It hits the mountain range in the Yukon, and it stops there. So we have this additional player, and jack pine is a pretty fast-growing conifer. It also has serotinous cones like black spruce. Pretty big seeds, so it's able to send a root down through the dry surface soils in a new burn. So it may be that we see a sort of different story there. So we'll take a look. Similar kinds of figures, but in this case, we've got black spruce up here, jack pine down here. Again, zero change, or zero proportional change means same conditions post-fire as pre-fire. A positive value means an increase, and a negative value here means a decrease. And we see in jack pine dominated stands really no change. There's no change in jack pine representation, so jack pine stays the dominant species. No change in black spruce representation. But when we take a look at black spruce stands, so these are stands that were dominated by black spruce before fire, or stands that were mixed, so mixed jack pine and black spruce stands. What we see in both cases is a big decrease in proportional representation of black spruce in the community, and a big increase in jack pine. And I'm sure many of you have driven, I just drove back, as I mentioned, I just drove back from Simpson today, and there's a number of spots along that highway through. You've got this shoulder-to-shoulder jack pine recruiting right along the highway. Really young guys, they're really dense, haven't yet started to really self-thin a lot. This seems to be a direction that a number of these black spruce stands are going in. Seems sort of the best predictor of jack pine recruitment is whether it's just the presence of jack pine. If you have it in the stand, it seems to do very well following a burn. And you can see what the outcome of that might be. Even if you have kind of 50-50 black spruce and jack pine, these two seedlings are the same age. Here you've got a jack pine that's 2 years old. Here you've got this little tiny black spruce that's 2 years old. And this one is also 2 years old, this jack pine, and those are 10-centimeter intervals on that marker. So that's like a 50-centimeter tall jack pine. So these guys grow very quickly and do very well. But from the perspective of the kind of change that we might see in the forest, we're going from, even if we're going from black spruce to jack pine, they have, similar types of understory conditions in many of the stands. They support, lichen biomass accumulation in many of these stands, similar kinds of, similar structure and function in these systems. So less of a change than if we were seeing those sorts of shifts toward deciduous. And this is just a picture of one of those stands where we have this very high density of jack pine coming in. Each of those seedlings is a new little jack pine recruit. So that third objective, is there evidence of successional shifts associated with severe burning? Well, sort of. We see sort of what I would consider weak evidence that there may be an increase in representation of birch in the Taiga shield, and some much stronger evidence that jack pine is doing very well following fire compared to black spruce, even in black spruce dominated stands. So the final objective is, how do responses in the Northwest Territories compare to other boreal regions? And so to address these questions, I've been on sabbatical this year, and one of the projects I've been working on is a North America-wide synthesis of tree seedling regeneration. And so each of these points corresponds to a site that we have tree seedling counts, information about pre-fire stand conditions, and some information about the conditions after fire. And so we have representation from the Alaskan Boreal interior, the Cordillera, the Taiga Plains, and the Taiga Shield. Taiga Shield both in the east and west, down here in the Softwood Shield and the Hudson Plains lowlands. So we can start to see, okay, well, we're seeing sort of different patterns in the Northwest Territories and Alaska. How does this extend across the range of these North American species? So we've got over 1,200 sample plots across 10 ecozones. This is over 53,000 seedlings, so it's a pretty great database to start to ask these kinds of questions with. And so what I've been doing is sort of taking a very tree-centric view to forest recovery. We're kind of interested in two things. Is the forest going to restock? Do we have enough seedlings coming in to replace the trees that were there before fire? A very trivial way to look at this is you need at least as many seedlings as you have adult trees of a particular species to restock, probably a lot more because we do see pretty high mortality at that stage. And the species composition, so the competitive processes. If you have a black spruce dominated site, does it stay dominated by black spruce? Or do you end up with a change in the dominance? You have a whole mix of species. In that case, you have to think about some of these interactions between different species as potential drivers of what's going to happen down the road. And so we can put this into this nice kind of little diagram. On the y-axis here, I've got change in stem density. So a positive change is an increase in density. You've got more individuals in your seedling population than you had pre-fire. A negative value is a decrease in density. That means you definitely don't have the number of seedlings you need to restock that forest with that species. And then you've got post-fire proportion of the population. So if you're dominated by a particular species, so 50% or more, when you decrease or sorry, if you maintain that, if you maintain a value above 0.5, then you're maintaining your dominance. If you drop below that, then you're decreasing in dominance. So we can kind of see some different trajectories. One is that you just don't have any individuals recruiting. You have regeneration failure. There was a recent paper that came out of the US that showed really high rates of regeneration failure in American forests following fire. Do we have that kind of pattern? On the other end of the spectrum is good establishment, where you have an increase in density and a maintenance of dominance. This is self-replacement, right? You have lots of individuals to replace the individuals that were killed during the fire. You also maintain your dominance. Now, in between that, there's a number of other categories. Maybe you have a decrease in density and a decrease in dominance. This is kind of a bad news story for that particular species, and something else will come in and replace it probably. You can have good establishment of lots of species, so you decrease your dominance, but increase your density. This is where we have these competitive processes coming into place. In the case of that study in Alaska, black spruce was coming in at high frequencies, but poplar was coming in similarly high frequencies, and poplar was able to grow much faster. Right, so you have these competitive processes coming into play there. Or you can have a decrease in density and maintain your dominance, and this may be where we see some stand thinning, a decrease in the density of the stand, for example. So these are some different categories we can think about that bring those two pieces of a forest-centric view of post-fire recovery together. I apologize for this. These are the six-letter lingo for each of these species. This is black spruce, Picea mariana. This is jack pine, Pinus banksiana. So these are in stands dominated by each of these. So 50% black spruce or more, 50% jack pine or more. And then these are those categories. So there's regeneration failure. We see that's happening in about 10% of cases, or sorry, about 15%. This is total regeneration failure. This is regeneration failure of the focal species. So about 15% of sites are showing complete regeneration failure for that species. But the story here is that, between sort of stand thinning, so you maintain your dominance but decrease your density, and self-replacement, maintaining dominance and increasing density, it's about 60% of the sites. So 60% of the sites are likely to be stable in terms of their species composition following fire. And then the remaining 30% kind of have, remaining 40%, there we go, my math's starting to deteriorate. We see different patterns of either enhanced competition, successional change. So these are kind of your change categories. So about 40% of the sites show potential for some degree of change. 30, and then about 70% show maintenance of the dominant species. We can look at this as a function of site moisture. So this is for black spruce only. What we see is that in the driest sites, so this graph, we have our expected patterns based on the numbers in the data. We have our observed patterns, so what we actually measured. And so what we see is that at dry sites, we have higher than expected failure of regeneration in Picea mariana. We have higher than expected frequency of enhanced competition, so those places where you've got good recruitment, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff coming in, so you have a decrease in dominance of the focal species. In the intermediate sites, they're not showing so much really strong patterns, but what we're seeing in the wet sites is much lower than expected frequency of these sort of regeneration failure and successional change categories, and much higher than expected frequency of maintenance of that species, so either self-replacement or stand thinning. So wet parts of the landscape seem to be much more resilient to change for black spruce than dry parts of the landscape, and this is probably not too surprising, but this is for across the entire North American boreal forest for black spruce. We can also think about this in the inverse, places where black spruce wasn't dominant. Do we see any potential for expansion? So where it wasn't dominant, increasing dominance and increasing density. So that's sort of, in the previous figure, it would be the self-replacement, but here we can think about it as potential for expansion. This isn't a really frequent category, so it's this category here for Picea to fall into, or for trembling aspen to fall into. So in both cases, it's, 10, 13% likelihood that that's going to happen. What we see across all of the North American boreal, though, is that places where jack pine was not common, it's increasing in density and increasing in dominance. So jack pine seems to be a real winner in post-fire communities. And this sort of deciduous shift that has been observed in Alaska, most of this proportion of change here is actually sites in Alaska. So there's other stuff going on across the rest of the North American boreal, and a lot of it involves jack pine. So very different stories than very different things happening in different parts of the boreal landscape across the country. So just in conclusion, we've got, again, back to our combustion points. Combustion severity is really driven by landscape position. The sort of moist, not too dry, not too wet parts of the landscape seem to emit the most carbon during big fire events. Less than half of the landscape is showing the potential for post-fire community change, so most of the landscape is pretty resilient. It's those kind of dry parts of the landscape that seem to be particularly sensitive to change following fire. For black spruce, that is. For other species, it's a little bit different. But transitions from black spruce to jack pine are most common in the Northwest Territories and also across the rest of the North American boreal. So this is a really common kind of transition, shifting from black spruce to jack pine following fire. So it lets us think about the implications of these different post-fire ecological pathways. You think about, deciduous forest versus conifer forest. Again, thinking about the kinds of understory communities that occupy jack pine versus black spruce forests, they're going to be much more similar than what you'd see in an aspen or a poplar forest. Different implications in terms of resource use, and again, thinking about wildlife habitat in particular, the maintenance of conifer cover maintains a much more similar kind of wildlife habitat. Now, I'm just going to touch very, very quickly, 2 slides, and then I'm done, on kind of the next steps in this. I mentioned that I was meeting today with one of our crews who've been doing this chronosequence sampling. So the data I was showing you today were really focused on those 2014 fires, but we've also been working with the NWT to sample in older fires, so 30-year-old fires, 60-year-old fires, older than that. So we've sampled forests that are as old as 200 years old. And this gives us the potential, the ability to understand when those systems start to stabilize in terms of their recovery following fire. So this is just a map of where we have sampled each of these black dots. Is one sampling location. These are all on the Taiga plains. This summer we're sampling on the Taiga Shield and actually doing some sampling up in the Sawtooth as well. And this is just kind of a little spoiler. I'll give another talk at some point, hopefully when no one's talking about the Franklin expedition. But this is just a little example of the kind of data we're getting from this. So here are some lovely pictures of reindeer lichens, different Cladina species, and we can look at the recovery, so the volume of lichen biomass as a function of time since fire. So here are the age ranges of those stands, 25 to 50 years, all the way up to 150 to 250 years. So some of these stands are really quite old, and what we see, and this is not uncommon to see sort of a peak in lichen biomass around 125, 150 years. This is very similar to other parts of the boreal landscape. We're comparing this to some almost identical data from the Saskatchewan Boreal Shield. It seems to recover a bit faster there, a bit further south. The lichen seems to grow a bit faster. We see a peak more in this age range for the Saskatchewan Boreal Shield. So this summer we're adding the Taiga Shield and the Sawtooth in, and we'll have a nice sort of latitudinal gradient of lichen biomass recovery that will really help us understand when do these sites get to be prime caribou habitat, for example, from a lichen forage perspective. These are really important food resources for caribou in the wintertime. And with that, I will thank you. Love to acknowledge all of these wonderful communities that have helped us and various folks in the GNWT that have been just hugely supportive of this program that would not have been possible without that support. And I would take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Baltzer. For anyone who is posing a question, since we are recording this, I would ask that you come and pose your question to the mic. Thank you.
I wonder, I wonder if this is, if your interest or the interest of the sponsoring bodies, government departments, et cetera, that that fund this study, whether it's purely academic in that you're just interested in what's changing and what's not, or whether and what the economic interest is. I'm wondering, off the top of my head, I'm thinking they'd be interested because there would be economic changes if the forests change, so the animals will change and that kind of thing, and also cultural losses, cultural changes and things. I wonder if you can just say what the spin-offs of your studies is likely to be.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I guess, originally when we started this project, there's a number of potential answers to that, and I'll kind of go through them. The funding we've been getting from the Cumulative Impacts Monitoring Program, they're really interested in caribou habitat and how that's recovering. Boreal caribou is a species at risk nationally, and there's a caribou management strategy that's in place, and part of that strategy states that 65% of the landscape has to remain undisturbed. That's both sort of human development pressures, but also fire. And so within that framework, a forest is thought to have recovered after 40 years. And this is something that, there's not a whole lot of data for the Northwest Territories to understand how fast that recovery happens. And so this is a real interest to, community members, to the government, to know, how long is it going to take before these fires, especially after a really big fire year like this, how long does it take for those systems to get back to something usable from a wildlife perspective? Or is it, are these systems changing to something that's not going to support one type of wildlife, but will better support a different type of wildlife, for example? So that you're very right, the sort of wildlife habitat and how that may be changing is a really key thing. We can also think about, predicting fire behavior. Different types of forest drive different fire behavior, and that is not something I'm an expert on, but when you have a jack pine forest, it burns differently than a black spruce forest, and that burns differently than an aspen stand. So understanding what these forests are going to look like after these kinds of large fire events will help fire managers to sort of plan forward and think about what the implications of these kinds of, any changes we're able to identify will be from a fire management perspective, which is, critical from a community safety perspective, from a from those sorts of angles. So thinking about land use in conjunction with some of these regulations associated with boreal caribou habitat management is one key thing, and these aspects of changing fire behavior is another one, I think. I'm sure there are others, and people can chime in if they want, but those are a couple that jump right to mind, yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Perhaps I missed the answer to this question, but what is it about the jack pine that does so well as opposed to the black spruce? You said they have the same cones, the same defense mechanism, the same release.
Well, they don't have necessarily the same cones. So jack pine, if you've ever looked at a jack pine cone, they're much woodier and thicker, and they have a really, they're close, so they're fully serotinous, so they typically only open after fire. Black spruce will open under warm temperatures, for example, and as they age, that waxy coating sort of comes off. So they're considered semi-serotinous. Those woody cones of jack pine actually are pretty good at resisting fire too. So it takes a lot more to burn through those cones than the sort of lighter, kind of more papery black spruce cones. And we certainly, it's not data I talked about, but we did put out hundreds of seed traps and looked at drivers of seed rain in these systems. And the severity of canopy combustion is really what predicts black spruce seed rain, or viable black spruce seed rain, so those seeds that are still going to germinate and produce a seedling. So there's sort of differences in the ability of those cones to resist fire. There's also a real difference in the competitive ability. Jack pine just grow really fast. So even if you have both of them kind of recruiting in similar numbers, jack pine can outpace black spruce pretty much any day of the week, unless maybe you're talking about a peatland system and they're completely waterlogged. So they're faster growing, and so as a consequence, they get up higher, and will form that dominant canopy species. Yeah.
Sorry, Jen, generally speaking, how do forest fires affect permafrost?
That's a great question, Tim. So I guess the initial response to wildfire, first of all, you're burning the canopy, you're increasing the light and the energy hitting the ground surface. You're also blackening that ground surface and burning away. So permafrost is really protected by that beautiful organic soil that I was showing you that was burned away. So you do kind of three things to change the energy balance and the energy input into permafrost. And one of them is opening up the canopy, lots more energy hitting the ground surface. The second one is that you blacken the surface, and so you change kind of the albedo. You absorb more energy on the surface of the ground, and you burn away that really insulating layer of organic soil, at least some of it. And so we tend to see, pretty rapid deepening of the active layer or the seasonally thawed layer following fire. Depending on where you are, this will either just recover as the forest recovers. In some parts of the Northwest Territories, though, we're certainly down into that really sporadic permafrost zone where it's ecosystem protected permafrost. And when you disturb that ecosystem, you can actually sort of drive loss of permafrost from those parts of the landscape. So we've been monitoring active layers at all of these sites since 2015, and then Jean Holloway from University of Ottawa has had ERT arrays, so geophysical measurements, looking at the changes in permafrost. And these are all in pretty southerly places, right? It's all down in the Decho that she's been working. And so that's the region, that's sort of the southern fringe of discontinuous permafrost. And those are places where you could see really rapid change with fire. Further up in the Sawtooth, or even somewhere like, say, around Wrigley, it's likely that once the forest starts to recover, once the organic layer starts to reaccumulate, that permafrost that active layer will shallow up again, right? So depends on where you are. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Oh, one more question.
I'm sorry, maybe you've answered this, maybe it doesn't mean, but for, let's say, the paper industry or lumber, is that of any benefit having jack pine over black spruce, or is this not even counted to that?
There's not a huge amount of forest industry in the NWT. I guess there's a little bit of harvest that's planned for biomass production. They're both softwood species. Pretty similar density in terms of their wood, so I can't imagine that would really have a big impact. I guess jack pine tends to make bigger trees. Yeah, so there might be more potential in terms of other uses than black spruce is pretty small and spindly in much of the NWT. So bigger jack pine might have more potential uses from a forestry perspective.
Is there more uptake of carbon with jack pine compared to black spruce?
For sure, but you typically find less accumulation of organic soils in jack pine dominated stands. So it's sort of a little bit of you have bigger trees, so more carbon stored above ground, but less stored in the soils. So the net impact of that. And what it means in sort of more mesic locations, it's, less clear. But yeah. Okay, great, thanks everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Baltzer. Appreciate you speaking with us this evening, and I would like to present this token of appreciation on behalf of the Legislative Library.
That's okay. It's an old mic.
Okay. It is. Yep. Okay. Thank
Thank you. Thank you again. And with that, that concludes this evening's presentation. Have a good evening. Thank you. Merci et merci.